Hey, how are we doing, everybody, and welcome into the SFS channel. My name's Gavin, and today I wanted to take a second here to make a quick video to talk through 5 players I'm currently really excited about and 5 guys who I see as must-draft players here in our Dynasty Startup Drafts. These are players who are still very youthful, have a lot of shelf life and prosperous NFL football left in front of them, and I think can be key Dynasty roster centerpieces here as we move forward. And I think that for essentially every name on the list today, the best is still in front of them. And these are players who could be appreciating assets if you were to draft them for your Dynasty League. So with that being said, let's not waste any time. Drop down, give today's episode a like, and let's get started. Of course, as always, if you're new around here, we want to have you guys join the SFS community as well. So click that subscribe button, turn the bell on so you're never late for an episode and are notified whenever we publish new content here. About every other day is the schedule we're going right now for the fantasy football offseason, but I will continue to put this stuff out all offseason long and give you guys my dynasty analysis. So the first player on the board here is not necessarily some sleeper or someone that you've never heard of. It is Javonte Williams. Of course, he is someone who has a very high ADP and draft price in our Dynasty Startup Drafts. But this is a player who I think could potentially see his ADP surge even higher than it is right now and become a very, very high first-round pick depending on how this Denver Broncos situation progresses this offseason. And right now I see this as a situation that isn't necessarily the greatest or wasn't the greatest during the 2021 season when you've got Teddy Bridgewater and Drew Lock as your two quarterbacking options and you're kind of in a 1-2 split punch with Melvin Gordon and there's no really true RB1 in this backfield. There's only so high you can fly at the running back position, and we saw Javonte Williams never really realize the workhorse potential that we thought he could have last year, and that was something I talked about throughout the season, having him as a trade target, someone to try and snatch up and get a hold of at every opportunity because the cost wasn't that much in a redraft league. But here in Dynasty, obviously with the youth entering into just year 2, and again, the opportunity for this situation to get light years better in 2022 is what this is all about here. Javonte Williams is someone who doesn't necessarily have a super high level of career touches, so the wear and tear on his body for such a physical player is quite low, which is another thing I love to see. At North Carolina, he was splitting time in the backfield with Michael Carter, so he wasn't racking up a huge or absurd volume of work like a Jonathan Taylor was per se as the lead back at Wisconsin for 3 years. You've got a relatively clean player who then comes in here year 1 and has Melvin Gordon taking some of that load off of him as well. So with Gordon as an impending free agent, you now have a door opened up to have Javonte Williams be the lead back for this team, the true number 1 3-down player for this team who can catch the football, play extremely physical, still being in that 1-2 punch role. Was a player who led the National Football League in broken tackles in his rookie season. And that's all not to mention the quarterback play for this team. I think that has a huge difference in impact on the overall ceiling and upside that Javonte Williams can provide for fantasy owners. You talk about the difference between being in a good offense and a bad offense and the opportunities and exposure that a good offense gets you to sustaining drives, having longer time of possession, controlling the clock in games against bad football teams, and racking up high levels of fantasy points and ultimately usage, which will net a player talented like Javonte Williams with the volume and opportunities he needs to get those points. So anything from drafting a Kenny Pickett, who I think is a very ready NFL quarterback, to making a big name splash trade for an Aaron Rodgers would be a incredibly large improvement at this position, because you're talking about a really low ceiling with Teddy Bridgewater and Drew Lock, and especially with Drew Lock under center, an incredibly low floor for this offense's overall output potential. So Javonte is someone I am absolutely looking at and taking ahead of other running backs per se, like obviously a Christian McCaffrey right now, or I shouldn't say obviously, but in my personal preference, I would rather have a Javonte Williams for the long haul if I'm going to take the longer punt year 1 approach to my Dynasty Startup Draft. Obviously, you would rather have him. This is kind of where I was going with that obviously comment. I had 2 thoughts jumbling around in my brain at the same time. Obviously, right now, with the issues surrounding Alvin Kamara and the uncertainties with that situation, I would take Javonte over him. And obviously, those other veteran running backs in Austin Eckler, a Dalvin Cook, who do have some mileage, some wear and tear on their bodies, I'm taking Javonte Williams over those players. Really the only two players that I am 100% without a doubt taking before I take Javonte Williams would be a Jonathan Taylor and a Najee Harris, and you could toss DeAndre Swift into that conversation, but personally I prefer Javonte Williams. So a great opportunity here. That's the moral of the story. Antonio Gibson is my next player I want to talk about here, entering into his third NFL season with the Washington Commanders. I do need to change that on the screen. I see that I still have the abbreviation for Washington Football Team. But Antonio Gibson is someone who I have a really large amount of intrigue around concerning his skill set and his lack of touches. And this goes back to Javonte Williams. But an even more, or I should say, an even less concerning situation than Javonte. Antonio Gibson has less than 1,000 career touches at this point throughout college and the NFL. He's someone that played wide receiver as a collegiate athlete, so he has a very low amount of wear and tear on his body, and I see him as someone who hasn't necessarily had a overly significant injury. Now, he did have the nagging shin this past season, but it didn't cause him to miss any games. So I think that Antonio Gibson, again, with that skill set, the size that he possesses, his dynamic ability to be a pass catcher, really give you some upside here, and a player who could be useful to your dynasty roster for the foreseeable future in terms of what that means at the running back position. So Gibson, again, is someone, you look at his situation in Washington right now as something that's not overly favorable, but this is another team that could be in the quarterback market, whether that's drafting, making a trade. Jimmy Garoppolo potentially is a name that could fit in with this team nicely. There's a lot of options that can improve the offensive output of this team and in turn positively impact Antonio Gibson's fantasy scenario. He's got the talent. He's got the ability. Now that situation just needs to be put in place because I think that overall to this point, everything has played out very, very well in his favor, and I think that sets him up nicely to be a dynasty steal. If you can lock him up as your roster's RB2, that would be fantastic. But even in a certain sense, I think he has enough longevity left in him that he could be someone you consider as your team's first running back off the board if you were to not draft this position in round one of those startup drafts. The next player I want to talk about here is Kyle Pitts. And Kyle Pitts, obviously, for those of us very invested into the Dynasty community, have very strong thoughts about. If you ask me, I think Kyle Pitts is that next level tight end prospect. He has that athletic build, the size, the wingspan, and the elite next level speed. That's what it comes down to here. The route running, the wide receiver-esque traits and qualities that he possesses at this insanely large size. This has the potential to be the tight end one overall if he stays healthy for the next 8 to 10 seasons. And I don't say that lightly. Travis Kelce right now is in his early 30s. I believe he just had his age 32 season, walking into age 33 season next year. I could be off by a year on that one way or another, but he is still getting it done at a top 3 level into his 30s. So the tight end position is one, obviously, as well, that for fantasy football players, we know how tough it is to draft players at this position that can have longevity and a long lifespan of success and productivity. Personally, in my primary dynasty league, I was fortunate enough to roll the dice a little bit, and in the 4th round of my startup draft back in 2020, this was basically in the middle of COVID that we did this draft, I ended up drafting Mark Andrews, and things played out for me great this season. He was fantastic year one, but obviously tight end one overall this year. But talking about Kyle Pitts here, this is your chance to land that player that for basically a long stretch of time, upside of that being a decade, you can solve this position and not have the headache every draft season of trying to find a sleeper tight end or waste a draft pick on someone who's probably just going to be a flash in the pan and never really play out as a long-term sustainable option at that position. So you get a guy as well who made the Pro Bowl in year one, had 1,000+ yards at this position. That's very rare, almost unheard of for a tight end. But we don't think of this past season as one that Kyle Pitts was overly dominant because, you know, outside of those 2 back-to-back 100-yard games, it was a fairly quiet year in the raw scoring department because he only had 1 receiving touchdown, and that is something I do not expect to be a consistent factor going forward. I think that the Falcons need to emphasize getting him the ball in the red zone, drawing up more plays for him. And I honestly expected him in terms of overall production. Now, the one touchdown was underwhelming, and at the end of the day, did kind of prove me right in the sense that I expected him to not finish as a top 3 tight end this past season. Because rookie tight ends tend to struggle, and that was something I had kind of baked into my analysis of him last season. However, I do see a lot to be excited about and a lot of reasons to be bullish on Kyle Pitts moving forward. So, again, if you have the opportunity to solve this headache, get this position squared away in a startup draft with someone entering just their second NFL season and Megatron-esque qualities at the tight end spot, you'd be foolish if you're up on the clock and he's within relatively respective range of drafting him to pass on him. So Kyle Pitts, someone I'm all over in startup drafts this year. Jaylen Waddle diving into the wide receiver position now for the Miami Dolphins. Jaylen Waddle is someone who, after this postseason, I feel is being pushed a little bit to the back burner. I absolutely love the talent and the dynamic ability that he has to score fantasy points. I was a little concerned out of Alabama when the Dolphins drafted him. Now, I was extremely happy that Tua Tagovailoa and Jaylen Waddle had previously built chemistry and had familiarity with one another, but I was a bit worried with the track record Tua had up until this point in his career of passing the ball down the field. I was worried that Jaylen Waddle, someone who we saw unleash his burners over the deep middle of the field or making insane spec catches down the sideline at Alabama, I was concerned about Tua's inability or lack of ability to deliver on those deep shots downfield. I was concerned about the other talent in the wide receiver room impacting Jaylen Waddle's fantasy production. And thankfully, against my own personal beliefs, I drafted Jaylen Waddle in a handful of leagues last season, and it paid off fantastically because what I didn't incorporate into my thought process was the underneath game. The fact that he is so dynamic and has so much talent. I liked him as my number 2 wide receiver in last year's draft class. I went back and forth with him and Javonte Smith, but at the end of the day, I just cut on the tape and I preferred Jaylen Waddle. Now, they still have a long career in front of each player. I think they'll each be successful at the end of the day, but the explosiveness, the burst of Jaylen Waddle, his ability to go up and make those catches, his ability to be used a little bit in the wide receiver run game. And again, getting back to what I was, meaning to get to here, I just kind of find myself getting off on a little bit of a tangent just because of how impressive Jaylen Waddle is to me. They use him in that quick wide receiver screen game. They get the ball out to him quickly in the flats, and they use that burst and that acceleration to get him a high volume of passes per game and to use his physical traits to accumulate yards after catch and ultimately pick up first downs and keep the sticks moving. So they have found a way to use him in Miami. I also, while I wasn't a fan at all of the Brian Flores hiring for firing, I was a fan for fantasy purposes of bringing in an offensive mind in Mike McDaniel who can potentially use Jaylen Waddle's skill set at a further level and potentially use him in ways we didn't see so much this year. There were a few occasions when we saw him catch passes downfield, but maybe McDaniel can help that get elevated to the next level, and we can see him and Tua become even more efficient down the field, and that would be something that would improve the scenario a lot more. So despite having other wideouts in the building, despite the fact that Tua isn't the best deep ball passing quarterback, I love the skill set that I'm presented with here. I love the opportunity. And I think that in PPR leagues, Jaylen Waddle is someone who deserves to be picked very, very highly at this wide receiver position because of the long-term value he possesses for teams. And then probably the player that's going to go last of these 5 in your startup drafts, but someone I am still very, very apt to drafting at this point is Elijah Moore, the wide receiver for the New York Jets. All of these players have played in 2 NFL seasons or less to this point. So we have 4 rookies from the 2021 class who are entering their second season, Antonio Gibson being the one player entering into year 3 here. But Elijah Moore is someone who I absolutely love as a prospect or he's not a prospect any longer, but someone who has prospective potential to get a stranglehold on that number one wide receiver position in New York. And when you're tied to a playmaking quarterback like Zach Wilson, I think that's a very, very valuable offensive spot to be in. I still expect a lot of bumps in the road for this Jets offense. I still think that Robert Saleh has a lot of work to do on the defense, but I think that if Mike LaFleur, Matt LaFleur, the Green Bay Packers head coach, his brother, the offensive coordinator for the Jets, if he can help Zach Wilson take that year two jump and just be significantly better than he was last season. That's not saying that Zach Wilson has to be a top 10 or even 15 NFL quarterback, but last season, I mean, as expected, his rookie year was a bit rocky. He had some flashes which were excellent. Some of those flashes were to Elijah Moore, but I would like to see him obviously take that jump to being even a middle tier quarterback in the league. And I think that can do a lot for Elijah Moore's fantasy potential. He was getting the job done because of plays that Mike LaFleur had designed for Moore. He was being able to find fantasy success while catching passes from Joe Flacco, while catching passes from Mike White, and there was one more quarterback thrown in there who came in relief of Mike White, who got injured in the middle of a primetime game. Josh Johnson. The name slipped me there for a second. So Elijah Moore is going to have a lot of opportunities, I believe, in this offense. I think that he can clearly surpass Corey Davis here, who dealt with injuries for a large majority of last season. Obviously, that impacted the pecking order in this offense. But I think that Moore's upside, his ceiling, his deep ball ability, and the fact that he can play out of the slot make him an incredibly versatile weapon for this Jets offense. And I expect him to be someone to get the football coming his way a lot in this offense for a long time here moving forward. All right, that was my quick rendition of 5 players that I would consider must drafts here in those Dynasty Startup Drafts. I'll be continuing to add to this list. Probably the next episode you'll see will be 5 players I am not drafting, so do not draft these players type of a thing for Dynasty Startup Drafts. So make sure, if you haven't done so already, to drop down and click that subscribe button, join the SFS community, and support the growing channel here. Drop a like on today's video so other Dynasty players can find our content, and drop a comment or a question if you have that as well. I'd be happy to get back to you, answer your questions, comments, concerns, and help you out in your leagues this year. Also, feel free to join the SFS community Discord server. The invite link to that is in the description of today's episode, and that's just another way that you can get in contact with me and get my advice on your teams moving forward. So, thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you in the next episode. Peace out.